You're always late. Late to your own effing funeral. Those are the words that Tommy DeSimone, played by Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, said as he placed the silenced pistol behind the head of the Samuel L. Jackson character, the infamous Stax Edwards, who's number 5 on our list of Black Mafia associates, and it's an interesting list. Pernell Stax Edwards was born in the South Bronx. He was a big guy, 6 foot, 300 pounds. He got built when he went to prison, and he briefly bodyguarded for Muhammad Ali. Now, Tommy DeSimone is actually who met Stax Edwards and brought him in to the fold of Henry Hill and the rest. And they met out on the Avenue in 1967 in Queens. Stax Edwards, who was an aspiring musician, was, I think, playing the guitar. Tommy DeSimone, who was very lowly at this point, and was maybe 17 years old, was selling watches. And they met and they became friends and they started doing stuff together. And DeSimone would even refer to Edwards as his brother. Now, in the movie, Joe Pesci plays Tommy DeSimone 30 years older than DeSimone was in real life. He was actually a young guy. He was in his late 20s. So he and Stax Edwards start doing a lot of credit card fraud. Edwards gets introduced to the Paul Vario crew, Big Paulie, and Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke and the rest. So it was the late 60s and early 70s, and Stax Edwards was an aspiring musician, so like many people that fit those two profiles, he developed some drug problems. He went in and out of prison. He was doing the credit card fraud, and he ends up getting some gigs playing at Robert's Lounge, which was owned by Jimmy Burke. So Jimmy Burke had Robert's Lounge, and Henry Hill had the Suite. They each had a lounge, and that's where a lot of those bar lounge scenes were set in Goodfellas. So in 1978, Stax Edwards was just a guy playing guitar and doing some credit card fraud, but he's in and trusted enough with Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke and the rest that for whatever reason, they picked to use him in the Lufthansa heist, which for a long time was the biggest cash heist in U.S. history. They got equivalent, adjusted for inflation, $23 million in today's money. But Stax Edwards, just like in the movie, he messed up. He was supposed to take the getaway car and have it compacted, but he went to his girlfriend Shelley's house. They drank, smoked weed. He fell asleep. Police found muddy footprints that were going to match his feet, and then they found fingerprints in the van. And that's when he went to go hide out in a South Ozone tenement with his girlfriend, and that's where Tommy DeSimone and his partner in crime found Stax at. They shot him 16 times. Even though Tommy DeSimone considered Edwards a good friend, he knew his drug addiction was a liability, and DeSimone was completely loyal and probably scared of Jimmy Burke. It would have been easy for the police, or probably they thought, to turn Stax Edwards into an informant because of his drug addiction, and so they had to shoot him 16 times. He and Henry Hill both called Edwards' mother, who they both knew well, and gave her condolences. Tommy DeSimone did not show up at his funeral, and he himself was whacked about a year later. So that's number 5 on our list, Pernell Stax Edwards of New York City. Jeff Riddle liked to tell people he was, quote, the Black John Gotti of Ohio as he strolled around Youngstown in the 1980s. And if you don't know about Youngstown, it once made the cover of Time magazine as America's most corrupt city.
I wouldn't even come out in my own yard here if the cops weren't going up. They go up and down every 15 minutes, day and night around here.
More recently, it's had years, in the top 3, 5 for murder rate. I think it might have had the number 1 murder rate once, the Detroit of Ohio, if you will. But mob presence there in Youngstown was split between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and there was some wars between them. And Jeff Riddle was actually instrumental in the mob war in Youngstown. He was a trusted lieutenant of Lenny Strollo, and Strollo was Pittsburgh's mob crew chief in Ohio, and Riddle was going around telling people that he was going to be officially made. He was going to become the first black official member of La Cosa Nostra. Now, I'm not going to say there's no one that's ever been made that had one non-Italian parent, but very, very few. And of course, Jeff Riddle had two non-Italian parents. But what was going on in Youngstown was kind of its own little world. And he was the right-hand man of Lenny Strollo, and he helped Strollo in the war that led to him taking over Youngstown. Riddle was running gambling and shakedown rackets on behalf of Strollo, and in 1996, he helped plan the assassination of Strollo's mob rival, Ernest Big Ernie Biondio, and the botched assassination of Youngstown prosecutor Paul Gaines. So Jeff Riddle, who I couldn't find a picture of, was convicted of racketeering in '99. I think Lenny Strollo's boss ended up turning an informant, probably not against Riddle, probably against corrupt politicians and stuff in Youngstown. And Jeff Riddle died in prison in 2012 of cancer. And just a few years back, one of his proteges got hit with a long prison term in Youngstown for doing some stuff with the mob. So Youngstown, a hotbed of mafia race mixing. This is number 3 on our list. My hometown, well, not hero, but a guy from Detroit, Francis, Big Frank Nitti Usher. And he, for a long time, had one of the most infamous names in Detroit on the streets because of a crime he was convicted of in 1979. There were 3 beheaded bodies found in downtown Detroit. He ended up being convicted. So who was Frank Nitti Usher? He was from Conant Gardens in Detroit, which was one of America's probably first upscale black neighborhoods from all the way back in the early 1900s. And he got a job as a driver for Tony Giacalone, the Detroit street boss. And he parlayed that into backing from the mafia and the heroin and numbers business. And by the late 70s, he was partnering with the guy Harold the Hawk Morton, Adolph Doc Holliday Powell, some infamous hitmen. The triple beheading at the Democratic Social Club was part of an internal power struggle, probably between Holliday and him.
Usher was convicted as being an aider and abettor. Nobody claimed he shot the people. He was basically there. They were all there. Well, let me not get ahead of myself. So he was convicted. He was doing a mandatory life sentence. His people came to me. I got a new trial based on, I can't even remember, I think it was a faulty jury instruction or something like that. At the time, he was also doing a fairly lengthy federal sentence for drugs because they had a conspiracy case there. The prosecutor's theory was that Partee and Red Freeman killed the people. Partee is some kind of kin to Frank, if I'm not mistaken, a cousin or something. But it might be a play cousin. I mean, they were supposed to be the killers. They were, according to the prosecutor's theory. And the jury convicted Partee, and he's doing life. Another jury acquitted Red Freeman, and Hayes doing life on another case now.
Freeman headed the crew in the 1980s after he beat that case, and the gang's original bosses either went away to prison or were executed.
What did people say? I mean, people said he was a hitman.
Murder Row was founded in the early 70s by the infamous Big Frank Nitti Usher and Harold the Hawk Morton as a subset of the Detroit Italian Mafia's Giacalone crew, selling heroin. Usher came under the tutelage of the Giacalone brothers at a young age, and it was the Giacalone brothers, 2 of really America's most respected, connected, and feared mobsters of the era who set him up in the drug game. So Usher was convicted in the triple murder and beheading and got a triple life no parole sentence. But a few years into his sentence, his old mentor, Tony Giacalone, got out of prison from his own prison term, and I've been told by excellent sources, paid for the lawyers, and there was an appeal, and the case was overturned. How do you overturn a triple beheading? Well, the lawyer is able to convince the judge. And in fact, Usher had been the target of the murder, and through his force of personality had talked the hitman into killing somebody else, and he merely helped dispose of the body.
So I got him a new trial, and we tried the case, and the evidence really was almost next to none. The case against Frank Usher was he was Frank Nitti. And if you're Frank Nitti, you're guilty. I think that the evidence showed that he was a target. I think it showed that somebody was trying to have him done, probably Doc Holliday was now dead. And that Frank, either by force of personality, quick talking, or luck, he got to the sideline rather than be one of the victims, And that's what I kind of think. But I think because he was Frank Usher, forget Frank. Nobody ever called him Frank Usher other than in court. It was always Frank Nitti, Frank Nitti, Frank Nitti.
So Usher got out of prison in the early 90s. He was not heard of getting any trouble for quite a long time. We were always told that he owned a health food store in Indiana, whatever the hell that means. But a few years ago, he actually made the news when somebody that was either riding in a car with him or that he picked up back in his old Coney Gardens neighborhood where he's from, made some sort of heroin deal with the police. But his lawyer told us he wasn't too worried about it, and I don't think much became of the case. And when Big Frank Nitti Usher died not too long ago, he was a free man, quite a career, and certainly one of the most fearsome black mafia associates of all time from anywhere in America. Number 2 on our list is perhaps the most intriguing to me, at least, and I may do some more stuff about him, Mickey the Cobra Cogwell from Chicago. And yes, he's who the name the Mickey Cobras, and yes, he's who the gang the Mickey Cobras is named after. Here's a photo. That's Mickey Cogwell. That's Jeff Ford, who started the Black P. Stones, and cut out of this picture is Jesse Jackson. Founder of the Cobra Street Gang on the west side of Chicago in the 1950s, Cogwell rose to be the Windy City's black underworld liaison to the Italian Mafia, known locally in Chicago as the Outfit. Now, when you think about just how did certain neighborhoods like black public housing projects in Chicago become these big open-air drug markets ruled by gangs, well, it didn't happen by accident. In the late 60s, when heroin use started ratcheting up, the Mafia sought out Mickey Cogwell. I don't know if they knew his name from the newspaper or whatever, the streets, they found him, and they started giving him the bag, and thus the symbiotic relationship between large-scale organized crime that import drugs from overseas, Chicago street gangs, began, and Mickey Cogwell was at the center of that. Now, he was kind of a rival in power to Jeff Fort, even though they were part of the same umbrella gang, and there's a famous photo shown of Fort often in documentaries with the guy standing next to him along with the rest of his El Rookin' generals with his face scratched out. That's Mickey Cogwell. Just about 10 short years before that photo was taken, this infamous flick of Jeff Fort, Mickey Cogwell, and Jesse Jackson was taken during the Chicago gang's tenuous foray into politics. Notice the power dynamic. Jeff Fort is clearly the dominant figure in the photo, and there is his right-hand man, Mickey the Cobra Cogwell, to his side. Perhaps, if you guys are good, Santa will bring you a more in-depth Mickey Cogwell story. He was number 2 on our list of most important and interesting black mob associates from Chicago, Mickey Cogwell. And last but not least, last in fact number 1, from Harlem, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. He's appeared in several people playing him have appeared in several big budget Hollywood movies, Hoodlum with Larry Fishburne, and of course most recently Forrest Whitaker portrayed him in Godfather of Harlem. Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. When he was 10, his older brother was accused of killing a white man, and his parents were afraid of a lynch mob. His parents mortgaged their home to raise the money to send both of them up to Harlem and away from danger from potential white killers. Up in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson dropped out of high school and began working various jobs, and he was hanging out in front of, I think, the pool hall of a guy named William Bub Hewitt, and they sort of got into it, and Hewitt respected his moxie, and Bumpy Johnson went on to be mentored by the earlier generation of Harlem gangster William Bubba Hewitt. By the 1930s, Bumpy was running the neighborhood and dispatched anyone who dared challenge him in brutal fashion. So there's a scene in Godfather of Harlem that plays this historically accurate event out. He was having dinner and he saw a rival sitting at another table, picked up the knife, gouged the guy's eyeball out, just sitting, you know, other people are sitting there eating, sat back down and told his companion for dinner, I suddenly got a craving for spaghetti and meatballs. Bumpy made his name nationally in the 1930s New York Numbers War, which saw several different factions vying for control of the city's black policy lottery trade in the days after Prohibition concluded. Bumpy Johnson was feared, respected, and beloved by the community, becoming the first genuine black criminal superhero, so to speak. Johnson worked for Madam Stephanie St. Clair, who was the policy queen and numbers racket before the state's legalized lottery was bigger than alcohol. And it seemed like people from the Caribbean, black people, brought it in large part to the United States. So in the early part of the century, check out my story on the Chicago numbers business, link below. In the early part of the century in Chicago, New York, black numbers banks were making as much or more money than the mob. And of course, at some point the mob wanted in. So like in the movie Hoodlum, the battle between Stephanie St. Clair and Dutch Schultz is shown. And Bumpy helped fend off the Italians and other non-black underworld figures for a while, but in the end, because you really can't stand up to the power of a national organized crime syndicate who are, at the end of the day, are white men and can more easily move in society and had corrupt judges and police on their side. So he made a deal. He basically was put in charge of Harlem. He took various narcotics conspiracy charges over the years. He's been painted in some of the Hollywood movies, you know, as a protector of the black community. I think that's misleading. He may have protected some black criminals from white criminals, but in the end, he just became part of the same organized crime system as everybody else. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack at 62 years old under indictment in a federal narcotics conspiracy case. Most recently, Starz series The Godfather of Harlem ridiculously portrayed him as Malcolm X's partner in fighting crime and drugs in Harlem and battling the Italians, when in fact, by the 1940s, he was the Italians' partner in crime in bringing drugs to Harlem. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the guy who fled South Carolina in 1905 from a white lynch mob, ended up fighting white gangsters on the streets of Harlem in the 30s, and then went on to be sort of the boss of Harlem for a while. Number one on the list, Bumpy Johnson, Harlem, New York. Our prophet, American Dope.